This is Coffee Number 5. I'm your host, Lara Schmoisman. Thank you so much for joining us again at Coffee Number 5. Today we're having Shannon Chavez, and today we're talking about sex. Shannon has one job that I don't think that a child ever thought about being what they want to grow up. So Shannon, tell us a little bit more about how did you get to be a sexual health and wellness specialist?
Great question. Everyone wants to know how I got interested in sex. And I think my earliest memories as a child were being curious about sex, because I remember mixed messages at home. You know, they would tell sex would come on TV and my parents would tell my brother to pay attention and for me to close my eyes. So I knew right away that it made people uncomfortable, that it was something I wasn't supposed to be curious about. The more I got into my studies in psychology, I realized that sex is a part of every single one of us. Everyone has a sexuality, is a sexual being, but because it makes people so uncomfortable, it creates so much shame. You know, I also grew up Catholic, where sex is, you hear these messages about dirty, bad, wrong, good girls don't. So for me, the minute I found out that sex therapy was an actual career, I knew that it would be a perfect fit because I'm comfortable talking about it. I have a lot of questions around sex, and I want to help people feel sexually fulfilled in their life. I think pleasure and connection is the one thing that we can't live without in life. We need it. We need it to be better human beings. We need it to live fulfilled lives. So for me, I love being a part of people's sexual healing journey. And for a lot of people, it's finding new ways to be sexual. It's dealing with old trauma and shame. But there's a lot of ways that I help people, and I love my job. I cannot think of another job I would ever want to do other than this work.
Well, I'm dying to ask you something about this part of Owen and who you are. You come from a very traditional family. I just want to hear the story of when you told your parents that you're going to go for this very strange job about being a sexual coach, basically.
Oh, yes. Okay. I'll start with my grandmother because it was the funniest story. She came to my office, and I remember telling her, I was a sex therapist, but for her, she's very traditional, even more traditional than my mother. And she said, why would anyone want to do that? Why would anyone want to come into an office and talk about their sex life? She even had trouble saying sex. I remember her kind of whispering it, sex. So, that was grandmother. And she said, why would anyone want to do that? I remember my mother saying something very similar. She was very concerned about what that would mean to be able to talk about people's sex lives. And I think what I learned from my family is that my family, like many people, are not aware of what does a sex therapist do. There's a lot of misconceptions about it. Even in my culture and family, therapy is taboo. So you add sex therapy on top of that, which is even more taboo.
If it makes you feel better, my mom doesn't still understand fully what I do either.
Okay, good. Yes, I mean, there was a lot of, therapy? And sex therapy? Yes. So for me, it was an opportunity to help them understand how important this work is. And now I would say my family are my biggest supporters. They still have I remember in the beginning, my mother would have trouble telling people the sex part. She'd be like, Shannon works with women and couples, intimacy. And it was so confusing. I said, Mom, just say it. Free yourself. Just tell them what I do and be proud of it, because I'm proud of all the work I do. So.
Okay. And how was dating being a sex therapist? Like, did you scare some people, or they expect that you were more adventurous because you were a sex therapist?
It's pretty amazing. I actually started my journey while I was dating my husband. So now we're married, and he has so much fun with it. He tells jokes and he says funny things. So I think he's a confident male. So he loves the fact that I'm a sex therapist, and he loves to see how uncomfortable people get when we talk about it. So say we go to a party and people say, oh, what do you do? And then you tell them and they kind of give you a blank stare. He loves that. He thinks it's so funny.
Oh, you have to tell me one story. Tell me something like really funny that happened.
I would say there's not a lot of funny, but there's a lot of shock. People don't really know how to follow up when you tell them you're a sex therapist, or you get the opposite, where the floodgates open and you hear about everyone's concern or questions or kinks, and they just let it all out. I would say the worst place to tell people you're a sex therapist is on an airplane in a long flight, because you may be answering questions and people want to just know everything there is to know. And it almost becomes a not so mini therapy session on a flight.
Oh, that's not good. But fun. I'm sure that someone will have a really interesting story to tell there. So let's say people find you
Mm-hmm.
and they will come to you and say, I have a sexual problem, or sex is interfering in my life, or will someone come and say, I feel that sex is affecting my job?
Yes, all of everything you said. So it can be issues in your relationship with intimacy and sex. It can be what you just described, compulsive sexual behavior, where maybe it's interfering with your day-to-day functioning. I also deal with things like kinks and fetishes, where people may have certain practices in sex that may be uncomfortable to the outside world or even in their relationships. So they're looking for a safe, judgment-free zone to talk about it, explore, learn, process, and understand their sexuality more. So I think that's what I provide in my space more than anything. Most people that come to me have never done therapy. So their first stop is sex therapy. They said, all right, I heard that this issue is more psychological than physical. Help me figure it out. So I would say the most common concerns I see with people are uneven desire in a relationship. So that's one partner wants sex more than the other. I see a lot of women that are dealing with pain, discomfort, orgasm issues, arousal difficulties during sex. So maybe they aren't really engaging in sex because of those concerns. For males, I see things like erectile dysfunction, ejaculatory control issues. And then for other people, they're just looking for some tools. Tools can be toys, ways to spice up their sex life, books to read. How can I become a more sexual person, or grow and explore my sexuality and have a clinician guide me there? So there's a lot of different issues that people deal with. But I always say 100% of people will have issues around sex. So there's not just certain populations that are more susceptible. We're all going to have something that comes up around sex.
Yeah, and let's start talking about that we are sexual beings. Mm-hmm. And sex is part of everything. We're in the street and we see banners and we see commercials and we see even radio shows that is all about sex and mm-hmm. music that will entice us. And so this doesn't exclude our work, our relationships and our friendships. And always, I call it the law of attraction that you have to have. And somehow it's always a sexual ingredient included in that. And it's how we feel about ourselves. Right. Do you feel like there is a connection of how we feel about ourselves in the sexual relationships?
Yes, absolutely. I actually call it the integration of sexuality and spirituality. So spirituality, not in the religious sense, maybe for some people, but more of spirituality as, who am I? What is my path in life? What are the values that I carry? And how does that impact my sexual expression? So I do feel that is important first and foremost when dealing with your sexuality, is to understand who you are, to work on the relationship with yourself. Because, for example, if you have low self-esteem, you're going to bring that into your relationships. It's going to affect how you are able to be as far as your behavior sexually. So we have to work on ourselves in order to be healthy sexual beings. And I say healthy in quotes because healthy for me may be different than your healthy, and we want to understand what is healthy for each individual person. So that helps you communicate with a partner, ask for what you want, and also claim your sexuality. That's a lot of the work that I do, is helping people know that no matter what kind of sex you want to have, claiming that is empowering, so you feel good about yourself sexually. Even if it's about, I'm having vanilla sex, or I'm not having the type of sex that's swinging from the chandeliers, but it's just I feel good about it because that works for me. That's a lot of the work that I do with people, is normalizing their norm and healthy and figuring out what works for them.
It's accepting basically who you are sexually.
Exactly, because you kind of named it. There are billboards, movies, TV that shows all these different representations of sex. It's confusing, especially us women. We see these hypersexual images of women and we think that that's what sexy is. And, if you don't fit that norm, you may feel that you're not good enough or you're not desirable. And that's absolutely not true.
You're bringing a great point there. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, 90s, and the sexy norm or the sexy image was completely different than nowadays. I think that nowadays there are different visuals of sexy. Back then, it was a lot more narrow-minded.
Exactly, and it's constantly changing. I mean, think about the Victorian era of corsets and tiny waists, or the 60s and 70s where it was about Twiggy, the fashion model, tiny thin bodies, and then voluptuous bodies, and then pubic hair, no pubic hair. I mean, there's so many trends that come along with our culture that inform sexy. And I think that can be confusing for a lot of people, because a lot of women will say, that's not my body type. That's not what I look like. Am I still desirable? Am I a sexy person if I don't have big breasts or, a Kardashian butt? All these things are helping to create some distortions around what is normal and what is sexy.
Well, that's kind of a body dysmorphia also. But so many women are going out there. I mean, I guess as a man too, but you see out there a model of sexy and you want to be that. But sometimes you cannot make it because you don't have that kind of body.
Right.
So how can you find out what kind of sexy works for you? And how can we differentiate sexy from sexual?
Very good. I think sexy is more of an attitude than it is a state of being. So sexy, you can be wearing sweats and a t-shirt and feel sexy if you have an attitude that is an attitude that says, I am sexy. So it's more of a mental experience than it is physical. It has to do with confidence, self-esteem, self-worth. You can see someone who doesn't fit the prototype of Hollywood sexy, but they own it and they have an energy about them that people are drawn to. So I think that's sexy. Sexual has more to do with our mental, physical, psychological components of our entire being. Sexual can be your sexual functioning, which is your ability to be aroused, experience pleasure, free from dysfunction. It can do with your values and boundaries you have in knowing what you're okay with and not okay with sexually. It could be practicing safe sex, and that's not only protection from sexually transmitted infections, but it's being able to stand up for your rights as a sexual being and take care of yourself sexually, being able to be free from coercion and sexual harassment. Things like this are part of being sexual. And a lot of these things are uncomfortable to talk about, but I think we need to talk about it so people are more educated and aware so they can protect themselves and live healthy sexual lives.
Well, you know that we're all about how we market ourselves. And we try to always give tips. And a lot of people, when they start going to the workforce or they go back or they're trying to get a new role, they feel like they need to find their new themselves in order to be attractive to get their new role. Mm-hmm. How to find that level of being sexy, be attractive, be professional at the same time? What would you recommend? What are the tips to find yourself in that position that you are it? Mm-hmm. If you have the qualifications for the job, of course.
Right. I think a lot of that can get very confusing because, again, it goes towards there should be a certain norm or ideal that you want to meet in order to be sexy. And I think for a lot of people, it's going on your own journey. I know for us women, we go through, and men, but women go through a lot of stages in their life where their bodies change. Hormones levels are changing. They're dealing with reproductive issues or menopause and issues in their life that affect being sexual, even on a biological basis. So we want to be aware of those changes and also know that there are no ideals. There's no one way to be that's going to make you better or less than anyone else. So we don't want to compare ourselves to others. I think one thing that's going on right now that's really positive is body positivity and women being able to empower themselves around finding communities of women and support from women that help them feel better in their bodies. And this has to do with whether it's body size or shape or anything like that, but they feel good about themselves and they're not being influenced by messages that may set those ideals up or make them feel less than. But I think women can be all of those things: professional, sexy, everything that you said. It's about owning all of that and integrating that into who you are and not feeling like you have to fit only one part of it.
And that you don't have to fake it. It's just part of who you are.
Exactly. It's part of who you are and owning it, no matter what.
This is so interesting. And I had so many more questions to ask you, but I just overwhelmed of having you here today.
Yes.
But thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to coming back.
It was so good to have you here today. See you next time. Catch you on the flip side. Ciao, ciao.